Me, huh? There we are. Okay, well, I'll move on. I guess someone's keeping time here, or do we have a timekeeper? All right, wait. Okay, well, thank you very much, Becky. Thank you for organizing this, but especially thank you, the Templeton Foundation, for funding this, and for Becky for bringing us all together so many times so that this, I think, is produced far more than just this conference, but also, I think, a really very long-term set of social and intellectual and personal connections that I think are the very definition of the good life. I want to talk about food, and I think I really want to. I think that I want to sort of challenge, use this the very first slide to just talk about what is happiness, and I think we can really think of happiness not really just being a state of mind, but really, but actually something in a part of material culture, and also really a set of social activities. So it's out there in the world. It's not something just in our heads. And I think food then is one way of looking at this. In food, the rituals of eating and sharing food together are not just ways of representing happiness, but I think they're actually ways of creating happiness and actually being happy. So I think that's the methodological framework or intellectual framework that I want to start with. I actually focused here in my research on restaurant eating, on chefs, on consumers. I've interviewed restaurant owners and chefs, over 100 people in Shanghai. I've talked a bit about home cooking, but mostly about what's going on in public. And one of the questions I asked a lot of people, including cooks and chefs, but also many ordinary people, is tell me what was a good meal recently, what was a good meal, and tell me what was a bad meal. And so I'm going to give you a preliminary analysis of what good and bad eating seems to mean to people. And I want to go back to my fieldwork in Shanghai 20 years ago. I landed in Shanghai in 1993. And there, I think there were really two ideas of good eating that really struck me, and I think it struck a lot of other people because people wrote about them. And the first is the banquet. And the banquet is this big round table, and it's always somebody inviting other people to eat and inviting them to share food. So it's a host-patron relationship, and it's about creating solidarity amongst that in-group of people through sharing food, and through this idea of qing ke. And I think there you have several people have written about this during this period, because it's really the prototypical place where people do guanxi, where people create social ties through eating together, and through this idea of this is the production of renqing, the production of human feeling through shared food. So that was something that we saw all over China, and even though people were critical of banquets even 20 years ago, they worked. I never saw people say, I hate banquets. They may have said, I don't like rich people eating too much, or government officials banqueting too much, but then they said, oh, but they really don't enjoy it. Rather, the idea was that this was something that we enjoyed. And I think was really, most restaurants were set up for banqueting. If you went to China, I remember going to China in 1990, there weren't seats for two people at most restaurants. It was a banqueting culture. But the other thing that emerged, and which also people really noted, was fast food. And fast food was really about individualism, consumerism, cleanliness, and modernity. And really what I'm saying here is I think the sort of shine is off on both of those types of eating experiences. In some ways, of course, banqueting is still common in China, but when I ask people, what was your last good meal, no one would mention a typical banquet, and many people would mention, actually, that is an example of their last bad meal, a banquet that was a work-related dining. So this kind of ingchou, this work-related dining, which I think would 20 or 30 years ago would have seemed to have been a very favorable thing, is now seen as one of an example of bad eating. So really the question here is, what is good eating now in urban China or in Shanghai? And I think we can look at this in public culture, and there's a lot of food journalism these days, and one of them that's very popular is this TV series called A Bite of China. And there you get the expression of good eating as people enjoying the regional cuisines of China and enjoying the variety of what's available, including many ordinary types of food. But on the other side of this is an even larger, I would say, a much more complex sense of this is a food crisis. And so especially in the last 10 years, but maybe even more recently, there's a sense that what we have in China is adulterated food, poisonous food, bad food, basically. Food is an area of social danger for a lot of people. So I think when we're talking about happiness methodologically, we really have to look at what's unhappy as well. So, and how does then happiness emerge in the spaces between sort of social descriptions of unhappiness. And I think really in many ways Chinese people live in anxious times, and there's a lot been written about this sense of general anxiety in China. So how do people, given that they have a larger sense of anxiety about society, find places where that anxiety can be relieved? So where can people get away from the bad food and find a good meal? And in addition to sort of the problems of poisonous food or bad food or adulterated food, sort of the food crisis, food safety crisis, there are other types of bad eating that people mentioned. Oppressive banqueting, sort of where you really are forced to eat. Eating alone, which is very common in urban settings now and is seen by most people as an unhappy meal. And then unhealthy eating, which I think was not really as big an issue. So fast food is now seen as unhealthy eating and a cause of obesity, for example. So the biggest vision of culinary dystopia is gutter oil. So even though this is a wonderful little street scene where you see people eating out, you really would, for a lot of people when they walk by this scene, they're thinking of this could be digoyo. This is the kind of oil that's reprocessed from garbage and made into oil and sold again. And one journalist, and I think it was the Washington Post, said, well, 10% of all Chinese restaurant meals may have digoyo in them, or this gutter oil. Now, gutter oil could be reprocessed oil from within the restaurant itself. And the chefs I talked to, actually one chef who studied Sichuanese cooking said that you have to use gutter oil when you're doing hot pot. So if you eat Sichuan hot pot in Sichuan, you're likely getting reprocessed oil. This was her take on it, whether she's right or not. So anyway, there's this general sense of a kind of food dystopia out there, and a great deal of anxiety about food. And one focus of this anxiety really is the migrant. So migrant culinary workers, I think, become then a kind of a figure in people's worries about not only food, but mainly about, of course, the people who are making the food. And one aspect of this that I would emphasize is that in Shanghai, somewhere at a very minimum, 95% of all culinary workers are rural to urban migrants, and it's probably closer to 99%. And this is based on just interviews with people. I don't have data on actually. But you really rarely in any type of kitchen meet a Shanghainese working in any kind of front of the house or the back of the house in a restaurant. So there's a great dependency upon migrant workers and a real denigration of culinary work in China, and a sense that if you're a Shanghainese, you don't get a job working in a restaurant or in a kitchen. So there's a sense that we're dependent upon migrant workers. This is not a very good job. And people then, so just this one quote is that this one man told me, he said, I don't like to eat in restaurants because I'm a rich guy and people hate us rich people and they're probably just going to spit in the food. So the sense is that migrants have this distrust of what they're doing to the food, and also a sense of there's a class antagonism that's emerged between rural and urban people. So I think that in many ways, I feel that in some ways, this anxiety about food is really an anxiety about society. It's an anxiety about the people making food, the kinds of poor people who are making food and scraping by. And what people would say to me sometimes is, 中国人没有道德底线 or 最低底线. There's no sense of a lower moral boundary. People will just do anything to make money. And there are these sort of somewhat apocryphal stories of like fake eggs. And I've been told that actually you can't even make a fake egg. But there were lots of people selling fake egg recipes that are fake egg recipes. So they're not even real fake eggs. But the idea can be sold to people because people assume that anything can be faked. So again, so the discourse is one of food being really, I think, a metonym for what is in fact bad society. So the question then is based on, given that background, then how do people cope with this? How do people try to create then what I think of as culinary utopia? So what sort of visions of a good life emerge? And what does that mean? Oh, okay. All right. So one way I think is people really, so what I'm talking about here in some ways is restaurant marketing in a sense, right? At least for the first part of this. So first of all, you have to sell people on the purity of your product. So these are two images. The first is one restaurant that I visited at the top. He actually shows you his organic vegetables, and he actually shows you photos of his farms where those vegetables are sourced. And they've actually gone out and then rented farm space in order to plant their own vegetables and bring them to the restaurant. So people have to go to great extremes to show you the purity of their production and show you the production line. So it's the opposite of Marx's idea of the commodity fetish, where we've lost where the commodity belongs in this chain. You have to de-fetishize the commodity to prove that the producers and the consumers are all connected together as human beings. You have to show photographs of the people cooking the food and making the food and growing the food. And this second one is a cow. This is from a beef producer that actually stuffed this cow and gave it to the restaurant owner so that they could show this is the cow that you're eating. Of course, it's not this cow, but it's a cow like this cow, and you can see the bullet hole on the back of the cow's head if you get close to him. So the other thing is the showing the production process. So instead of the closed kitchen, you see these open kitchens. So here, this is an open kitchen where you can see people working, making the food. So the idea is we're going to show transparency in our food production so that we can assure you that this is actually a clean process. And then this is the owner of the restaurant, and he has this sign up there saying 食品警察. So he's the food police. And he also practices martial arts, so he's a really tough-looking guy. And he is there to represent that he's controlling the quality of the food for you and making sure that this is safe. And then there's the idea of we're going to find people then that can make the really legitimate, authentic local stuff. And so one of the things that some people have tried, one of the problems and comes back to the issue of migrant workers. So the sense is that Shanghainese cuisine in particular has been lost because the people making Shanghainese cuisine are no longer Shanghainese, and therefore the taste are missing. So it's not merely that the food is poisonous, but the food doesn't taste like it should. So here you have this old Shanghainese chef, and he then becomes the kind of kanban, this sort of figure to represent the authenticity of the restaurant. So if you can find a real Shanghainese, that becomes another way of marketing then authenticity and genuineness. The other things, so, go beyond just merely the food products themselves. So I became interested not only in food utopias for consumers, designed for consumers, but also the ways in which restaurant owners are trying in some ways to create their own different types of work. So one sense is that we're trying to create spaces that are much smaller, getting away from the large banqueting halls, creating kinds of alternative forms of capitalism as well as alternative forms of eating. So some people have dropped out of corporate jobs, and one of the more peculiar patterns is this huge proliferation in Shanghai of cafes. And cafes are often run by people in their second career. And so these are people engaged in what's the sharing economy, people trying to, so these people that were running this cafe that you see up here on the right-hand side were actually a group of 3 women who came together to operate this in their spare time. The other woman is a woman who returned from Australia, and her cafe is known as 我要回家. And the name of it is it's a home. I'm coming home, and the idea is to create a homey atmosphere. So she creates this sort of homey-looking atmosphere in order to represent idea of the cafe as home, which is very different, I think, from the large-scale institutional types of restaurants that were popular not long at all ago. Now, the other more extreme example of this, and this is one I think that really speaks to a different, so that if the last one was a kind of a middle-class utopian idea of the cafe, this is the upper class idea of you actually get your own farm. And so these are people with money in Shanghai go to the countryside, and they will actually buy a piece of land and create then their own sort of little rural utopia on the margins of the city. So this is a man who I met. I hung out with these people. He is a factory. He produces furniture. He owns he's rented a piece of land on the margins of the city. He's built this cabin, and all his friends can hang out there. You can see that they have a duck pond, they have a carp pond, they have farmers, and then they have farmers who live on their property farming their land so that they can eat this pure, good food. And so these things are all on the margins of the cities, and wealthy people in Shanghai often have this kind of space to create clean food, and also to get away then from those kinds of banqueting cultures. So they eat what they call 农家菜. Which is really peasant food. So they don't go there to eat fancy, elaborate meals, but rather ordinary peasant cooking. And then they also try to cultivate this image of themselves as scholar gentry. So here you have a painting, a kind of calligraphy salon up here, and this man sells examples of calligraphy. So they're also trying to create this tie to traditional Chinese literary culture. And then you have more middle-class versions of this, of agro-tourism, people going to the countryside to try to then enjoy, again, nongjiacai. And here you can actually go buy the chickens and take them home. So on this trip, one woman brought a chicken and took it back, but they couldn't kill it, so they still have the chicken. In the paper, I did mention this very briefly. There are other working class versions of this. There are different ways that the state is trying to bring pure food to the people. It's not simply something just for the middle class and the rich. So this is actually run by the Jiedao, and this is in order to give elderly people, a chance to eat clean food. And then for people living in Shanghai, there's still the idea of the market as a place where you can create trusting ties. So these people go to the wet market, they know the people selling their food, and they believe that they're getting good food from these people they know. So again, for those older generation who still do this, there's a less anxiety about food than the younger middle-class generation who I think are cut off from their suppliers. So people that go to these markets and know these people don't feel they're dangerous. They're also, I think, very high-class versions of creating virtuous food through, in this case, this is a long story, but really this is a Buddhist restaurant owner who's created a high-class vegetarian restaurant in order to give people what he thinks of as also religiously pure food, but also to try to sell people on the idea of vegetarian food as a whole. And I think the other idea is the idea of let's reform the image of the culinary worker. So the culinary worker, which is a denigrated person in China, to be a chef, I think, was seen as a working class job. Now you're finally getting, I think, in China, this idea of the chef as a kind of member of the creative class, and you even get a play. This is an advertisement for a play about chefs. You get these successful chefs opening up a gongzuofang, like an atelier where they create special dishes. They're trying to pursue this idea of a Chinese high cuisine that can compete then with French high cuisine. So traditional Shanghai dishes will be redone in the art of kind of postmodern presentation that can win Michelin stars. This man has even created a floating plate that floats above the table so that when you eat your food, it's actually magnetically floating above the table. It actually, if it moves over slightly, it shoots off to the side, though, so it's not successful yet. And then, of course, the idea that for food to be good, you have to take a photo of it and share it with people. So food is not something that you just eat alone, but that you have to show to people, and a presentation is everything. So to summarize my presentation and to come back to what is the idea of what is a taste of happiness, what is a happy meal in Shanghai today? Well, I would say it has these three things. One is that because I think you have to understand the context of the larger dystopic visions of food, it's about pure products. And this involves connections to producers. Knowing who makes your food is important all along the production chain. And then it has to be now made by an artisan. So this is something, the idea that the food producer must be a person, a ren, not one of these people that's an anonymous migrant worker, but an actual chef, preferably not a migrant worker. And in Shanghai, one of the things that is that this food doesn't necessarily any longer have to be Chinese food. So there's a real proliferation of alternative cuisines. But these are what you eat. And then it has to be eaten in a kind of purified place, in a place that's not redolent of digoyo, not redolent of this dirty oil, but a place that's clean and seen somehow as genuine, as authenticated, either as part of the city or as through a connection to rural areas. And it has to feel like home, but it is not at home. And who do you eat with? When I ask people, who do you eat with? This was, I think, one of the more interesting questions that I'd like to explore a little bit more in the final version of this research. But it's an escape from instrumental relations. So when people talked about their bad meal, it was with my colleagues. It was especially with people outside from the company doing business meals. And also, I think, often the meals at home are not seen as particularly happy either, because you're eating with your children who you have to force to study all the time, or you're eating with your parents who are trying to get you to get married all the time. So the relations across generations can be either very stressful and sometimes even instrumental. So the people that you want to, when you ask people, who did you eat a good meal with? Everybody, just about everybody I asked it, with my friends. So the meal is a ritual place for enjoying this particular type of relationship amongst co-equal friends who are usually your high school friends or your junior high school classmates, people you've known for a while. Those are the good meals. So it's not banqueting, it's sharing food with people you know well, and eating out really is, I think in this time, a celebration of this other type of Confucian relationship, the fifth one, the relationship amongst friends, as opposed to the other types of hierarchical relationships. And it often doesn't involve kids or parents or colleagues. People don't like to talk bad about their kids, but when you ask them about your last good meal, it's never with their kids either. And these meals that are shared amongst friends, though, there's always a larger audience now, which is the larger group of friends that you're also sharing the meal with through photography. So there we go. Oh, thanks.